We have a special guest MVP today talking about Microsoft Teams and Power Automate. So I will let Daniel go ahead and introduce himself and get started.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, my name is Daniel Laskewitz. I'm from the Netherlands. I work at Sogeti, a big system integrator. And I work a lot with Power Automate and Microsoft Teams. Power Automate, for those who didn't follow the Ignite news, that's the new name of Microsoft Flow. So I'm going to talk about all the possibilities that are available in Microsoft Teams to combine it with Power Automate. And that's really exciting. So let me just dive in. There is actually a great connector for Microsoft Teams. There are some triggers. So as you can see, there's a trigger for when there's a new message in your channel, and when somebody is mentioned in a channel message. So that's for the person who creates a flow. So when you create a flow and you add this trigger, then the flow will trigger whenever the person who owns the connection is being mentioned in the channel message. So you could use this, for instance, if you have a service account and that service account is being mentioned in a channel message, for instance, or just for personal productivity. So whenever I want to get an extra notification when I get mentioned, or maybe I want to have a process start, for instance, add it to a to-do list or something like that, I can use that. Next to that, we also have a lot of actions available. I'm not going to list them all now. You just have them on your screen here. There are some really, really interesting ones. For instance, the post a message. It's already the V3, and that's because it's being updated a lot. You currently have a rich text editor in your post a message action. So you can make it really a nice message, nice looking message. And what I'm going to talk about today is actually the adaptive cards part of it. So I'm going to focus on this one during my demo. The post your own adaptive card as the Flowbot to a user action, that's the one I'm going to use. And the interesting about both of the actions for adaptive card is that you can just configure an adaptive card through adaptivecard.io and then copy and paste it into this action and use it, for instance, to send it to a channel or to a user. And that's really powerful. The scenario that I'm going to create today is a scenario where I'm using an approval. And because approvals aren't yet supported together with Office groups, that's why I'm going to use the bottom one and not the channel one, because otherwise I'm getting lots of errors. So that's why I'm using the bottom one. There's also a Flowbot, and I think they will probably soon rename this to Power Automate. And it has all kinds of cool scenarios. For instance, you can send adaptive cards with it. You can list your flows. You can describe your flows. You can do all kinds of stuff. You can also run flows when a flow, for instance, has a schedule, or when it's manually triggered with no inputs. So when you have a flow button, for instance, you can run that as well together with your flow bot. So let's just demo the flow bot. Let me switch to my browser screen, and I'll zoom in a little bit. So when you are in Teams, you can actually start a chat and just start with the Flowbot. It's already added to your tenant. Let's go ahead and list my flows. So you can just list them, and then it will give me back my flows here. And those are only my flows that I have that are triggered on a schedule or have no inputs for the flow button. I can even run a flow, and then I can, for instance, say, well, I want to run flow 2, and then it will actually start that flow. What's also possible is describing the flow. So you can, for instance, describe the same flow and use number 2 because it's in here as number 2. and then it will give the description of that flow available here. But those are just the simple scenarios you can do with the Flowbot. There's also flows in here, and when you open this, it will actually open a view of all your flows. You can also switch to team flows and even the new UI flows. Next to that, we also have the approvals part, where you can see your approvals, and I don't have one open right now, so that's why it's empty. But you can use the Flow app actually to do a lot of cool stuff in here. So let's switch to our presentation. The Teams app, you can also add that as a tab, for instance, to your teams, and then you could easily create flows that are contextual to your team. So you can use, for instance, some templates, and I heard there's going to be a lot more in there. You can use that Flow Teams app to start working on workflows that you could relate to your team. So, for instance, if you use a template, and you use that template to start whenever somebody posts a message in your team or in a channel, then it already has the template configured. So you don't have to fill in your own team and your own channel. It would just use that contextual information, which is really easy to use. So my demo I'm just gonna show in a bit is the budget request, and I have created a budget request for projects. I have a SharePoint site where I have a Power Apps form, and people can file their request in there. So they can create, on a new form, they can create a project name, they can ask for an amount of money for their project, and then whenever they filed it, it will automatically start an approval, and it will go to the manager of the person that filed the request. It will generate some custom responses, which are really cool for the approval scenarios in Power Automate. And then it will actually send multiple adaptive cards updates via Microsoft Teams. So for instance, when the request is in progress, when the manager is reviewing it, for instance, it will get a status update that it's in progress. And whenever the manager has responded, it will get, or the user who filed the request will get updated by the adaptive cards. And when you file a request, there's also a checkbox or a toggle where you can actually say, I want a Microsoft team to be created whenever it's approved, for instance. So that automatically a team gets created with the project owner in there and the person also who requested it. And that will go through the Graph API and Power Automate as well. So let's move to that. So I have my demo site here. I can do a budget request here. When I click New, I will just have a Power Apps form. I can do a Teams community call, for instance, as a project name. I can select a project owner, and I'm going to use my manager account here. I want a ridiculously large budget, of course, so I want $100,000, and I have here the toggle to create a team. When I click Save, my approval will actually get triggered. And I have my manager account on the other Chrome instance. And when I switch there, my manager, which is actually here, will get the approval card from Microsoft Flow, which will also still remain renamed to Power Automate. But it will give me the project name, for instance. It will give me who requested it. It gets the date. It gives me a link. So whenever I select a link, there we are. And to get a trial, so I'm going to skip it for now. But I can actually review the link with all the different options that are available, which I filled in. It got me a couple of choices in here. It got me 50% of what I asked, 75%, 100%, and a reject button. So as the manager, I can now select, for instance, the whole amount and select a comment in here. So good luck with the project. Now I click submit. It will automatically update and it will also display my response and the comments in here. And when I go back to the other account and I go to Teams, I can actually see that I have received some cards in here. Your budget request is now in progress, and then it has been approved. And you can see that I have some information in here as well. And if all went well, it also created a team for me. It's just a plain team. You can do whatever you want, of course, with the templates and stuff. You can add channels, tabs, whatever you want to it. But for now, it's just a simple team. So let's switch to Microsoft Flow to show you, or Microsoft Power Automate. I still have to get used to the name, and to my flows. And I can here edit the flow. And you can see what I actually did. So I start when an item is created. Action, a trigger from SharePoint. I use some expressions, which you can actually create by switching to the expression panel, and then, for instance, use mul, which is multiply, as an expression. And you can see the expression in here where I have used the requested budget and I multiplied it by a half. So that means that I get 50%. Next, I calculate 75% as well. I get the manager of the person who created the request. Then the approval gets created. And for this, make sure you pick the create an approval, because let me show you what you also can pick. If you select the approvals connector, there we are. There's multiple actions here. There's create an approval, start and wait for an approval, and wait for an approval. I am using the create an approval and the wait for an approval. And that's because the start and wait for an approval will actually create an approval and then send it to somebody's email. And then you will get it only in your email. And this scenario really was to keep people out of their email. So everybody's already flooded with email, so better to have it in Teams, for instance. And in this create an approval action, I can use the show advanced options to disable the notifications, which means that nobody will get, or the approver doesn't get the email. And next to that, I also use the approval type of custom responses, wait for one response. And I use the different responses that I already configured. So the first two are 50%, 75%. The third one is the complete requested budget from the SharePoint item I created. There's a reject button, and I filled in some other details as well. Another thing that's really important is the requester field, because if you use the requester field, it will look like that person requested the approval. And if you don't do that, the owner of the connection, and that's in this case, it's also me. But normally when an IT admin would create this approval, for instance, then you don't want to have that IT admin's name the whole time in the approval. So when you go further, there's the update item to in progress. So it changes the status to in progress. It sends Teams adaptive card to a user, and it uses the create by email again. So it sends it to the person who created the SharePoint item. It uses an adaptive card, which I had configured through adaptivecards.io. And that's really a nice resource to use to configure those adaptive cards. There's also some other options you can actually use, but I didn't do that in this case. You can actually use a summary, and you can also, for instance, use an alert so that it will show in the activity feed. Next, it will send the approval request to the manager. Also the same action, but it sends it to a different person. It sends it to the email address of the manager that I have gotten through the get manager action. You can select the mail just from the dynamic content field, and then it will actually send it to the manager of the person who created it. Then one other thing that's interesting is the adaptive card, because if you go to the create an approval action, that has the adaptive card in there. So you don't have to do anything about that. It already is there. They just give it to you for free. And if you use that start and wait for an approval action, you won't get that adaptive card because you don't have a moment in between start and wait for an approval to actually send the approval adaptive card to the manager. After that, there's the wait for an approval action, where I selected the approval ID of the create an approval action, which is also available in the dynamic content field. Then I select the first response and I get the comments of that. This is also an expression which I used. So I selected first here, and then I used the dynamic content field to get the responses. And then after that, I added a question mark with brackets and comments in between it, so that I get the comments property of the first response. And I did this because normally when you create an approval, you will get the approval comments in an array. And this is my way to actually get only one item of it. Next, I have an approval condition, and that condition actually checks the outcome of the approval is not equal to reject. And if that's not the case, so then it's approved. It will update the item to approved. It will send another adaptive card with an update where budget request has been approved. And then if created team, which was the toggle I used earlier, is equal to true, then I create a team. And to create a team, I actually need a couple of actions. I need to get the project owner profile. So I want to have the ID of that project owner, because I will use that in the create group action. The same goes for the requester. The requester will get added as a member to a team or to a group, and the owner will get added as an owner. Then I have an HTTP with Azure AD action, and I use this to use the Graph API to post to the groups endpoint, and then it creates a group. As I said, the owner is being added here, so the ID from project owner is inserted here. And for the members, the requester has been added. The replace action, I use that for the expressions to make sure that the project name doesn't contain any spaces and other weird characters. It has the group types unified to make sure it's an Office 365 group. It has a visibility of private, and it has some other settings available here. After that, I use the parse JSON action to get the body from the HTTP action, and I use the schema to get the ID of that group. Next, I delay for about 10 seconds, because sometimes when you create a team too soon after you create a group, it will give you some error. I use the create team action, HTTP and Azure AD action again, and that's a put method, and it uses that to actually create a team. So I used the update item to reject it. That's just an update item action for SharePoint again, with allowed budget to 0 and the status to rejected. It sets the comments as well, so the outputs of the comment action I had here. And it sends another adaptive card with the text of your budget request has been rejected. Better luck next time. So what I've used here is the create group endpoint, for instance, through the Graph API. And HTTP with Azure AD action is really easy to use because it just uses the delegated permissions. And when you, for instance, have an account that already is able to create groups, then you don't have to think about any authentication. It's just there, and that's really easy to work with. You can actually see some great examples on the Graph API website to see how you can easily create a group, for instance. And if I move on to the team, there's some interesting things you should know. For instance, at the top here, it says if the group was created less than 15 minutes ago, it's possible for the create team call to fail with a 404 error code. So what you have to do is retry the create teams call 3 times with the 10-second delay between the calls. And I have done that with the create teams call. And that can be done by clicking the ... and settings. And then you can use the retry policy and configure it here. So this is the way you can do that as well. So that's the easy part. If you want to explore a little bit more with the graph, you can actually use the new Graph Explorer. It's in preview right now. It has some great new features. And it's really easy to get, for instance, the teams and groups endpoints and try them out. So let's switch back. Yeah, so the future plans are actually to use group approvals in the future, because normally with high budget requests, we want more than one person to approve. We would also like to use attachments in approvals so that we can get easily to, for instance, a plan for that project so that we can review that first. Now we use a link for that. We want to use multiple templates for different teams. The templates are really easy to use, and you can create cool templates to make sure that for different project teams, you have different scenarios, of course. From single approvers to multiple approvers, that's one as well. And I would like to have SharePoint list formatting to make the list look pretty, because it's now really an ugly looking list for me as well. And that's also something we are actually planning on. For the resources, I've added a couple of links. I've added the Teams connector. That's the place where you can actually see all the different actions that are available. I skipped a couple of actions, so it might be interesting to see those as well. I have the adaptivecards.io site where you can easily create new adaptive cards. Of course, when you are using the dynamic content in Power Automate, you really have to make sure that you replace certain parts really easily. In the Power Automate Designer, it could be a little bit difficult to work with adaptive cards. So that's why I always use the adaptivecards.io designer to create them, and then to copy the JSON to Power Automate and then replace some values with the dynamic values from Power Automate. Next to that, there are also links to the Graph API docs, which you saw now, and the Graph Explorer. So with that, I would like to open up for Q&A.
Thanks, Daniel. And I also wanted to mention that we've got Harish from our Microsoft Teams team here as well to answer any question related to the topic as well. So open it up for questions.
Okay, there were a couple questions. I want to make sure these didn't already get answered. Are more Microsoft users hosting their spreadsheets on the cloud, i.e. SharePoint, because of Teams? If so, do you have any statistics around this?
By default, we store all files in the SharePoint or OneDrive, which is the default storage that Microsoft Teams is linked with. But in the files provider, you can change that if you wanted to other storage providers. But yeah, that's a more general Teams question than Flow.
And Daniel, Jonas wants to know, where can I download this great flow? Is it possible to share a template?
Yeah, I can share
of the tutorial with us. And so just to start, we will create a blog post with a summary of this and any relevant links, so we can include, Daniel, if there's some of those resources that you want to provide in that, we can work on that, and then we'll let everyone know where that will be so everyone can see it. But if you have additional information now that you'd like to share, that's great.
Yeah, so I will actually, I didn't do that yet, but I will share the flow and also use a site script which can create the SharePoint list, which I used as a backend for this. So this is something we would include in the blog post after this.
Okay, that sounds good. We have a good amount of time left. If anyone has questions, feedback, wants to hear about something, even if it's not flow related, that Harish can answer maybe.
Yeah, just a quick note on Flow itself. First off, Daniel, great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we are actually investing more heavily in Flow, primarily because of scenarios like this, where we want to help users customize teams using Flow for their own benefit, for stuff like for business processes like approvals or time off and so on. So one of the big investments we're doing is for more triggers and actions within Flow, so that it's a little more easier for you to create some of these experiences that even Daniel showcased. So along those lines, we are embedding the adaptive card designer into the Flow portal itself. Sorry, Power Automate portal itself, so that instead of you having to paste JSON, you can just basically construct your adaptive card right there. Yeah. The other one is we are creating a trigger for a custom message action. So for instance, if you wanted to trigger a flow off of a message, that is something that we're looking to enable in the near future. We're also adding triggers for when a new person joins the team, so that you can do onboarding kind of scenarios much easier. And yeah, so if there's more such triggers or actions that you feel are missing in the Flow connector today, I'd love to hear about it. You can shoot me an email or just send me a chat, and I'll be more than happy to take any questions.
Yeah, the adaptive card designer is going to be big. That'll be a lifesaver.
Yes, I know. A lot of people have been
yeah.
This question just came in. Will Teams Shifts app reflect changes made in O365 to users' profile automatically and immediately? Example, if I were to update their roles, titles, organization name, will that be synced immediately? So I guess the main question is about changes, if it will reflect changes made in O365 to users' profiles automatically.
It will, depends on your definition of immediate, I think. I think it takes a little while to sync across all the clients. So that is, I know that timeout will occur, but I don't know how long that is right now. That's outside of
but it will do it automatically, yes. I think is more the question rather than just immediately. Okay. And then Russell, oops.
Can I speak for that question? That was me.
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you for that answer. So under the Office Developer Program, I did use the sample pack to create users, and that was pretty good to bootstrap to get this user set up. But based on the use case I'm working with, I want to structure that user base under certain hierarchy and titles, right? The question I asked you is because if I were to do any mistake and if I want to get rid of all those users and start again from the CSV file, right? Will that be possible? Well, actually, I spell a couple more questions on that. One is, how do I reset those users, right? Second thing is, when I reset those users, is it reflected in Teams, immediately? And if there are already channels created for those users in Teams, what happens? How do I get to know a trigger on? And then particularly in the Shifts app, when I'm trying to do the scheduling. And the information on that is not very clear in the documentation, right?
Yeah, from what I understood, you're saying you're making changes for the users at a tenant level, right? You're changing the users in Office groups itself.
Right.
If that's the case, it should reflect down to each of the apps as well as the teams. If it's not, that seems more like a bug or an issue, which you should definitely send back to us.
Who should I be?
If the issue is that it's not reflecting in Teams or Shifts, I would start with Teams, and if it's a broader Office/groups issue, I'm sure they'll forward it along.
So Russell wants to know if private channels get their own planner as well.
I don't know. I'll have to check.
Okay, and so some of these questions for everyone on the line, we'll get some answers to them, especially the ones that we need to double check on, and we'll include that Q&A in the blog post as well when we post it in the next couple of days.
Okay.
And then there was a follow-up to the question about the SharePoint. He was asking because in the past, just a few people were actually storing their files in the cloud. Is this changing now? How many Excel users actually use their files in SharePoint or OneDrive? Don't know if that's a question for you guys to answer or for us to research.
Yeah, I can answer it because for me, I've seen more and more companies that were traditionally doing a lot with VBA and a lot with Excel and file shares and stuff like that. We've done tons of work to move them to the cloud, and I see more and more companies that are now actually doing all kinds of cool stuff with the cloud tools that are available. There's still work to be done. So there are still companies that have their file shares and maybe didn't have the money yet to migrate to the cloud, but they are moving there. And I see more and more companies also using tools like Flow and Power Apps and of course Teams to cover great business scenarios like these. But I don't have statistics, so that's the hard part.
No, it looks like that was a good answer. I
Okay.
definitely agree with that as well. And someone else chimed in, they use OneDrive mostly. So any other questions? Oh, in Shift's app, any code snippets or link to videos, documents that demonstrate how to set up initial schedule for a group or groups of users via batch upload? So I think they're just looking for some more information and resources on this. So we can look at including that again when we get all that information posted in the blog.
I don't know if they are in the Graph Explorer maybe, but there could be some code snippets in there. That's actually what they improved on with the Graph Explorer. They have some code snippets in there now since last week. So that's...
But does that capability exist? Uploading using CSV?
I don't know.
Oh, we can find that out.
Is there anybody from Shift's app that I can talk to offline?
I am not the person who owns Shift, so
do you...
we can at least put you in contact with Eric Vito. I can find out on my end.
Okay, that'd be great.
Laurie, I'll send it your way, and then we can set that up.
Any other questions? Let's see. Is Shifts widely used?
It is pretty widely used in the FLW space, that much I know, but I don't think we'll be revealing any numbers of how much usage it can.
I have a question, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
In order to create a flow or Power Automate and export that and use it in another environment, I found that to be rather cumbersome and complex, and there's a lot of things that you need to redo because things don't carry across.
Yeah.
Is there any work being done to simplify that?
Yep. So that is also one of the main areas we're focusing on, which is to essentially make it easier to share flows in such a way that like it's easier for the new person to just enter their account information and the flow will just start up. That's something we're working pretty closely with the Power Automate / Flow team.
Even to replicate a flow from team 1 to team 2, right? Which is kind of the internal version of templating, right?
Yep.
I think that's another spin on the same story, on the same question. Is there a company template platform somewhere?
Yes, that is also one of the spaces we're investing in. Flow has done a little bit of that in the past in what they call as send a copy or something like that, where essentially it creates an internal template ID and sends it across. But we're sort of rethinking that experience to see how it's easier to do it across teams or across users, across a group of users, and so on.
Okay, then a last one. If I create a flow, just to keep using that name for now, and take a trigger for a new message in a conversation, then it's quite difficult to do the filtering because in the majority of the cases, well, actually all of the cases, I'm not interested in all messages, but in a specific subset or a specific pattern. What I found now is that it takes something like 4 or 5 flow actions and actually quite a bit of parsing on my part in order to even get the relevant information, such as what conversation or what team was this posted to. Anything that you've planned to make that simpler?
That's great feedback, at least for the keyword portion of it. Not at the moment, but this is a good scenario. I can add it to my list for sure. But the way it's handled today, like you mentioned, is by using additional steps. But yeah, it's a cool thing. Like I'll definitely look into it.
Did you check the trigger conditions for that? Is that something that could help?
for some things it can help, right? But like I said, right, because the message body at that point in time is actually URL encoded, right? It's a JSON template. In some cases, you need to, process it before you can get at it. And that sort of actions are just too complex, right? But
so one of the
trigger conditions are what I use to at least reduce the number of times that the flow gets called in order not to execute quotas.
So it's similar in some ways to the mentions one that's already supported on Flow. That's also essentially listening to the same sort of graph API. So we could potentially look at adding when a keyword is mentioned trigger instead. That might help in this case. The other thing we're definitely doing is also fixing some of the outputs for that trigger. So today, if you get the output for that trigger, essentially is just a giant message body, which is in HTML. So we're doing things around having a plain text version of that, also outputting like a deep link to that message if you want to like link to it at any point in time, so that you don't have to do some of this construction and cleanup on the Flow side of things.
Yeah, because combining them together, right? Usually you take a trigger and then you want to respond to the same thread or the same team or the same channel, and then you need to hard code that stuff all over and over and over again. Right, so I found my own pattern. I've actually documented it, but it's cumbersome, right? And everyone needs to do it, right? So the simpler that we can make that, the better it is.
Agree.
Great feedback.
The Office 365 adoption preview in Power BI shows files and content, Teams and Power BI integration with Automate, and had triggers in Power BI. Would like to see a use case of that.
The adoption what? Sorry?
The Office 365 adoption preview in Power BI shows files and content, Teams and Power BI integration with Automate, and had triggers in Power BI, and would like to see a use case of how that works.
I'd like to know more about that question. I'm not really sure how.
Yeah, for me as well.
Did you maybe unmute and explain that a little bit more? We do have a few extra minutes, so that would be okay.
Yes, thank you. Typing on mobile, so didn't really work.
Yeah, no worries.
There was basically two things. I understood the question was whether we could see files on SharePoint being stored. And I know the Office 365 Power BI adoption preview shows quite a detailed list of how SharePoint is used. So maybe you can view and reference the reports in Power BI to look at whether there are more used in SharePoint now. There was an earlier question, yeah?
About the Excel files, yeah.
Yes. And I don't know for any future meeting whether something like Power BI and Teams integration together with Automate and triggers from Power BI would be a use case which could be discussed or reviewed. Okay.
No, that's great. We'd love to hear more about the topics you guys want to hear about too. So we're happy to have, to plan some of those. So that's no problem.
Felt like a dedicated shift session.
Yep, we can work on that for sure. Thank you for that. Okay, and then Lou asked, are there any plans for messages to be sent to a person over Graph API? Right now, we can only reply to a message that already exists via Graph. We can't start one from scratch and target to a specific person.
It is in our backlog for adding that as a Graph API, but I don't have any exact timelines on it.
And can you create a Power BI tab for a channel?
Yes.
Correct.
Does Microsoft Teams have a lookbook similar like SharePoint?
I am not sure. I have to check with our marketing team. I know we created a few for Ignite around the platform side of things, but I'm not sure of one that's online.
Okay, we can find that out for you and we'll get that answer out there.
There are some basic templates, of course, different types of templates for, I think it's healthcare and education and stuff like that. So maybe they're looking for something like that.
Okay.
How do I find the email address for my Teams room? I read somewhere every Teams room has an email address, and I believe each channel has an email address. Or
Yeah.
you can,
for channels, I know that you can get that, but for team room, I'm not sure.
So for the channel, how do I get that or derive it?
That's possible through the Graph API.
Okay.
You can get the channel,
Actually,
and then you will get.
For a channel, you can just click on the overflow menu, ... and there's a get email address option.
Thank you, sir.
There is another question. How do I send a DM in Teams?
You can go to chat, and there's a little button on the top that says new chat.
Yep.
Or you can just search for the person on the search box on top, and that creates a DM. I'm assuming you meant direct message, but yeah.
Yep, that's what I'm assuming too. Yep, there's a little button right at the top.
The pencil or something is there. Yeah.
On the email link that you said, that is for the channel.
Yes.
It doesn't really show for the team itself, correct?
Yes, it's for the team. I don't think there's that option.
There's none for the team, but for the channel, you can right-click on the ellipsis and pull it up. I had one other question on the workflow side of it, on the flow automate, Power Automate, which you guys call it now. Is there an option? Are you guys looking at? I know lots of feedback has been provided where you can change the email address of the person you create in the workflow, because when you create a flow for a list and send it out, everything that's getting initiated by that email, the from email address is from the person who created the flow. Is there an option you can give us the option to change that so we can make it on a service account or a different email rather than the developer who's creating the flow?
So Flow does support using a service account, but it's a little bit cumbersome to set up. I can get the Flow team to help, maybe do an article or help something to make that a little bit easier. On the team side of things, I can let you know that at least for sending a message, we are investing in an on behalf of option especially for the bot thing, so everything doesn't come via the Flow bot.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, and if you guys can provide some feedback on that from the Flow team, that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
So in my workflow, I use the delegated permissions through the HTTP with Azure AD, but you can also use the HTTP connector, and then you can use the application permissions through the Graph API, for instance. So that would give you non-user, some other scenario as well.
Okay, is there any documentation on that I can look up?
I think John Liu has shared some blogs about that. I can add them to the blog post as well.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, and then a couple more questions that just came in. When can we use app credentials for Planner?
We'll need to follow up on that. I don't have exactly.
Okay. And then do you recommend SharePoint for team tab development or Microsoft Graph?
It depends on your scenario and what you're trying to do. If it's a simple list or SharePoint web part, then I'd suggest SharePoint. But if it's a more complicated flow where you're trying to access multiple Microsoft resources, then Graph might be a better bet. But if you do the Graph route, you will also have to build some kind of UI to show within the tab. So that's something to take into consideration.
Okay. And last question, it looks like, is accessing Graph API free in production?
Yes, as far as I know, there's no cost.
As far as I know too, yes, there's no cost to using Microsoft Graph right now.
Through Power Automate, it actually is. So the HTTP connector and the HTTP with Azure AD connector, those are premium connectors. So you need one account actually that has a premium license on there to actually use those calls.
Yeah, on the Power Automate side for sure, but I think the question was generic Graph or maybe.
Okay.
No, but this is a good question. So on Active Directory, so you're saying 80 connectors, they cost money in production?
Yeah.
So under the Office 365 developer license, do we still get charged in non-production when you are building things?
If you are building, you can of course use trials for Power Automate as well. And you can just run that to test out things, of course. But whenever you're in production, you have to get a license for it.
Got it. But as a part of developer program, is it automatically free for mock production?
I think you have to request a trial for that. They give you some slack at least for the developer accounts.
Oh, one more quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to make it easier to work with auth tokens for the Graph API?
Yes, making auth simpler for apps is a big thing that we're investing in. So we're doing investments within the SSO space to make it simpler to get auth tokens both for bot-based apps as well as graph-based apps. But again, I don't have an exact timeline.
Okay, and that's okay. Sounds good. Can I customize your own connector with Graph API?
Yes. So what you, for instance, could do is you could use Postman as a tool to configure all your requests and create a collection in Postman and then export that into Flow and use that as your custom connector. So before the Teams team actually created a lot of APIs or created a lot of actions within Power Automate, I used a custom connector to already work with those APIs, for instance. And that was really easy to do. And there's tons of resources on that as well. So if you look for a custom connector flow, you will get all kinds of results in Google if you actually look for them.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. I know a number of people had dropped off, but for those of you who stayed and asked more questions and provided feedback about what you'd like to hear about, we really appreciate it. We have our next call in December, and that is December 17th, so the third Tuesday of the month. And then we'll be creating new calendar series for the 2020 year. And so you can look for information on that.
Thank you, everybody. And
thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.